February 1, 1922. Los Angeles, California. Just after 8 o'clock in the evening. A sound like a car backfiring rolled through the Alvarado Court apartment complex in the Westlake neighborhood. Faith McLean, who lived directly across the courtyard from bungalow 404B, heard it. She went to her window and looked out. And what she saw, in the cold winter dark of a February night, was a figure emerging from her neighbor's front door, a figure in a long coat with the collar turned up and a plaid cap pulled low over the face, walking unhurriedly down the steps, turning left, and disappearing into the alley between the building and the shared garage. She watched the figure go. She went back to her evening. Her neighbor was William Desmond Taylor, one of the most celebrated film directors in Hollywood. And when his valet, Henry Peavey, arrived the following morning to prepare breakfast, he found Taylor lying on his living room floor, fully dressed, with a bullet in his back. By the time the police arrived, the crime scene had already been destroyed. Not by accident. Not by carelessness. By design. What happened inside 404B South Alvarado Street in the hours between the sound of that gunshot and the arrival of law enforcement is as central to this case as the murder itself. And it is the reason that one of the most high-profile murders in the history of American entertainment has never, in over a century, been officially solved. Before we go into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you want more cases like this, subscribe. Because the person who most likely killed William Desmond Taylor eventually told someone exactly what she had done. She told them on her deathbed, 42 years later, on the kitchen floor of a small house in the Hollywood Hills. And by then, there was nothing anyone could do about it. To understand what happened in that bungalow on the night of February 1, 1922, you need to understand what Hollywood was in 1922. Not the Hollywood of today. The Hollywood of the silent era. A world so new, so fast-moving, and so entirely without precedent that the people inside it were making up the rules as they went along, with all the freedom and all the danger that implies. The American film industry had exploded in the decade between 1910 and 1920. Studios had moved from New York to Los Angeles, drawn by the sunshine and the varied landscape. Stars had been created overnight and elevated to a level of public adoration that had no equivalent in any previous era of entertainment. People who had been struggling actors or stagehands in 1910 were, by 1920, among the most famous human beings on earth. The money was enormous. The parties were notorious. And the press, hungry, competitive, and largely unrestrained by the legal protections that would develop later, was watching everything. Into this world had come a man who was not quite who he said he was. William Desmond Taylor had been born William Cunningham Dean Tanner in County Carlow, Ireland, in 1872. He was the son of a British Army officer, educated at Marlborough College in England, and by his early 20s had made his way to America with the restless energy of a man for whom one life was never going to be sufficient. He worked on a Kansas cattle ranch. He prospected for gold. He joined a touring theater company. He sold antiques in New York, married a woman named Ethel, had a daughter, and then in 1908 simply walked out of his New York life and disappeared. He left his wife, his child, his business, and his name behind him. He reinvented himself as William Desmond Taylor and eventually arrived in Hollywood, where his intelligence, his charm, and his genuine talent as a storyteller made him one of the most sought-after directors of the silent era. By 1922, he had directed 59 films. He had a reputation for working particularly well with young actresses, drawing performances from them that other directors could not. He lived well. He entertained frequently. He had deep friendships across the Hollywood community, most notably with the comedian and actress Mabel Normand, who had struggled for years with cocaine addiction and whose sobriety and professional survival Taylor had helped to support. He was, by every account from everyone who knew him, one of the genuinely decent people in an industry that had more than its share of the opposite. He was also, as the investigation would reveal, a man with secrets so layered and so deep that no one in his life had come close to knowing all of them. On the evening of February 1, 1922, Mabel Normand came to visit Taylor at his Alvarado Court bungalow at approximately 7 o'clock. They had cocktails, orange blossom gin, despite prohibition, and talked about books and philosophy, the kind of evening these two particular people apparently spent together regularly. At around 7:45, Taylor walked Normand out to her waiting car. They blew kisses at each other as the chauffeur drove away. Taylor went back inside his bungalow. With the exception of his killer, Mabel Normand was the last person to see William Desmond Taylor alive. At approximately 8 o'clock, the sound that Faith McLean heard from across the courtyard was not a car backfiring. It was a gunshot. A single bullet, a .38 caliber round, had entered Taylor's back on the left side. The angle of entry, and the positioning of the bullet holes in Taylor's jacket and vest, which was slightly misaligned in a way that indicated his arm had been raised at the moment of the shot, suggested that he had been standing in an embrace with his killer when the gun discharged. Someone he had let close. Someone close enough to hold. That same someone had then calmly walked down the steps of the bungalow, turned left, and disappeared into the February dark while Faith McLean watched from her window and thought nothing of it. The following morning, when Henry Peavey's screams brought the neighbors running, what arrived at 404B South Alvarado Street in the minutes before the police were called was a specific collection of people that tells you, by itself, something important about how Hollywood operated in 1922. Studio manager Charles Eyton arrived. Studio representatives arrived. Actors and actresses from the surrounding units of the Alvarado Court complex gathered. And while these people moved through the bungalow, while they opened drawers and looked through papers and, in at least one documented case, removed items from the premises before the police had been summoned, the crime scene was being systematically altered. The police chief who received the initial report was told that Taylor had died of natural causes. When Lieutenant Tom Ziegler arrived and found a bullet wound that made natural causes difficult to argue, he also found a room full of people who had been through it before him. The careful chain of custody that a murder investigation requires had been broken before law enforcement had walked through the door. What was taken from that bungalow in those pre-police minutes has never been fully established. What is known is that among the items investigators eventually found at the scene were a handkerchief monogrammed with the initials MMM, for Mary Miles Minter, a teenage actress who had worked with Taylor and was known to be infatuated with him. They found pink silk lingerie. And when they searched Taylor's files, they found love letters. Letters that made clear a relationship whose nature Taylor had worked to keep private. What investigators did not find were other letters they had reason to expect, correspondence that should have been in Taylor's files but was conspicuously absent, as if someone had known exactly where to look and what to take. Mabel Normand had also been seen by witnesses leaving the bungalow in considerable agitation on the morning the body was discovered, before police arrived, and was observed searching through items in a particular location inside. She later explained that she had been retrieving personal correspondence. The studio had evidently made a similar calculation and acted accordingly. The investigation that followed was one of the largest the Los Angeles Police Department had ever conducted. It was also one of the most thoroughly compromised. The suspects emerged quickly, and they were numerous enough to fill a casting call. Edward Sands had served as Taylor's valet in 1921. While Taylor was in Europe, Sands had forged his employer's name on checks totaling more than $5,000, stolen jewelry and clothing, and wrecked Taylor's car. He had then disappeared. Taylor, when he discovered what had been done, had reportedly told a friend that if he ever saw Sands again, he intended to kill him. A few weeks before Taylor's murder, a strange package had arrived at the bungalow. Its contents were never fully established, but investigators believed it was connected to Sands. After the murder, police mounted an extensive search for him. He was never found. Time reported in 1929 that he was being sought in connection with the murder. Whether he was alive or dead, nobody could determine. He has never been accounted for. Mabel Normand, the last confirmed person to see Taylor alive, was subjected to intense scrutiny. Investigators examined the possibility that her drug suppliers had been the target of Taylor's behind-the-scenes campaign to clean up Hollywood's narcotics problem, that someone connected to the drug trade had seen Taylor as a threat and acted accordingly. The theory was plausible but could not be proven. The attention destroyed what remained of Normand's career regardless. She died in 1930, her lungs damaged by tuberculosis, her professional life in ruins. She was 37 years old. And then there was the Minter situation. Mary Miles Minter was 19 years old in February of 1922. She had been a child star, promoted aggressively by her mother, Charlotte Shelby, who had legally falsified Mary's birth date at one point to allow her to work when her actual age would have barred her from certain roles. By her late teens, Mary had become a genuine star in her own right, and she had developed what can only be described as an obsessive attachment to William Desmond Taylor. By her own later account, she believed they were in love. By Taylor's account, communicated to at least one friend days before the murder, the situation had become something he described with exhaustion rather than fondness. What was found in his bungalow told a complicated story. The monogrammed handkerchief. The lingerie. The letters, which spoke of feelings that, from Mary's side at least, were neither casual nor ambiguous. But it was Charlotte Shelby, Mary's mother, who most investigators, then and since, have looked at hardest. Shelby was a woman who had built her entire financial existence around her daughter's career. She controlled Mary's income, her schedule, her relationships, and her image with the totality of someone who understood that her own security depended on Mary remaining a bankable star. A romantic scandal involving an older man, a man old enough to be Mary's father, a man who might marry her daughter and take that income out of Shelby's control, was exactly the kind of development Shelby could not afford. Shelby owned a .38 caliber pistol. In August of 1922, 6 months after the murder, her mother Julia Miles was reportedly seen throwing what appeared to be a revolver into a bayou near a Louisiana plantation. The gun was later said to have been retrieved, but it has since disappeared. The question of what Charlotte Shelby was doing on the night of February 1, 1922, was never definitively answered. Her alibi, that she had been with a man named Carl Stockdale, was later undermined by testimony that Shelby had paid Stockdale $200 a month for the rest of his life after the murder. For what service, exactly, was never established. In 1937, when a civil lawsuit between Shelby and her other daughter Margaret Fillmore produced testimony in which Fillmore said she had protected Charlotte against the Taylor murder case, a grand jury investigation was opened. Shelby appeared before the grand jury and denied everything. The investigation produced no charges. Shelby died in 1957. She never confessed. There were other threads. There was the matter of Taylor's hidden past, his abandoned wife and daughter in New York, the antique business left behind, the name he had discarded. There was evidence suggesting that someone with knowledge of Taylor's secret history had been using it to extort him in the period before the murder. There was a connection, unexplored by police, between Taylor and a local blackmail and extortion ring that had been operating in Los Angeles in the early 1920s. And then there was the filmmaker King Vidya. In the 1960s, Vidya, a celebrated director who had known Taylor personally, began his own private investigation into the case. He was considering making a film about it and wanted to understand what had actually happened. He traveled, he interviewed, he dug through records. The conclusions he reached, shared with Detective Lieutenant Thomas Anderson in a recorded conversation, pointed firmly toward Charlotte Shelby. Vidya's research was eventually documented in a book called A Cast of Killers by Sidney Kirkpatrick, published in 1986. The book laid out the circumstantial case against Shelby in more organized detail than any previous account. It also raised the question, explicitly, of whether the district attorney's office in 1922 had been motivated by friendship with Shelby and by pressure from the studio system to steer the investigation away from her. The Los Angeles sheriff, at the time, said publicly that police had succumbed to influences brought to bear by powerful interests connected with the cinema industry, that the most important clues had not been followed up, and that blind trails had been started to lead the investigation away from persons high in the cinema industry. This was not speculation from a journalist or a conspiracy theorist. This was the sheriff of Los Angeles, saying publicly, in February of 1922, that the investigation into the most famous murder in the country had been compromised from the inside. The industry protected itself. And it worked. For decades. Then, in October of 1964, a woman was dying on the kitchen floor of a small house in the Hollywood Hills. Her name, at that point, was Pat Lewis. She had been born Ella Margaret Gibson, had appeared in silent films under several names including Patricia Palmer, and had worked briefly with William Desmond Taylor at Vitagraph Pictures in the early 1910s. She had had a difficult life. A 1917 drug arrest. A 1923 arrest connected to a blackmail and extortion ring, the the same kind of operation that had been linked to Taylor's final weeks. She had converted to Roman Catholicism late in life. On the night she was dying, she watched a local television program that included a segment about the William Desmond Taylor murder, now 40 years old and still officially unsolved. According to her neighbor, who was present, Gibson became hysterical. She blurted out that she had killed Taylor and thought it was long forgotten. The following day, she suffered her fatal heart attack. There was no priest immediately available. So she made her confession to whoever was there. She said she had been a silent film actress. She said she had shot and killed a man named William Desmond Taylor. She said she had nearly been caught. She said she had fled the country afterward. And then she died. The neighbor's son, who had been young and present that day, did not know who William Desmond Taylor was. He did not fully register what he was hearing. It was only years later, after reading about the case, that he understood what the woman dying on the kitchen floor had been confessing to. By then, she was long dead. There was no physical evidence. There was no corroboration beyond his account of what he had witnessed. Gibson had apparently made similar remarks the previous evening while watching the local television program. She became hysterical and blurted out that she'd killed Taylor and thought it was long forgotten. The confession came twice, in other words, once the evening before, while still alive and capable of sustained speech, and again the following day as she lay dying. It was consistent. It was specific. And it was, for anyone examining the case, not entirely without supporting detail. Gibson had worked with Taylor. She had been involved with a blackmail ring of exactly the kind that investigators believed had been targeting Taylor in the months before his murder. She had, according to her own dying words, fled the country after the killing. Her connection to Paramount Studios, Taylor's studio at the time of his death, through the roles she received immediately after the murder has been noted by researchers as a possible detail of significance. Whether Margaret Gibson killed William Desmond Taylor is, like everything else in this case, ultimately unresolved. She confessed. Nobody investigated the confession in time to do anything with it. And the official police files on the Taylor murder disappeared entirely by 1940, leaving researchers to work from newspaper accounts, witness interviews, and whatever private records survived. The crime has been officially unsolved for over 100 years. And it will remain so. This case leaves three things that belong in any serious conversation about power, truth, and the machinery that decides which murders get solved. The first is about what happened at that crime scene before the police arrived. When Henry Peavey's screams brought people running on the morning of February 2, 1922, the people who arrived at 404B South Alvarado Street understood exactly what they were looking at. A murdered director. A scandal that, if it developed in the wrong direction, could take down careers, studios, and the public image of an entire industry. The studio representatives who moved through that bungalow, who searched through Taylor's papers and removed what they chose to remove, were not acting impulsively. They were protecting an industry. The evidence they took, or destroyed, or reorganized, was the evidence that might have pointed an investigation toward an answer. That decision, made in the minutes before law enforcement arrived, may be the single most consequential act in the entire history of this case. Not the shooting. What came after it? The second is about the sheriff's statement. In February of 1922, the sheriff of Los Angeles County said publicly that the murder investigation had been steered away from people connected to the film industry by powerful interests. He said the most important clues had not been followed up. He said blind trails had been created to mislead the investigation. He said this in public, to the press, at the time. It was reported in newspapers across the country. And it produced no meaningful consequence. No independent investigation. No reform of the process. No accountability for the interference. The statement was made, recorded, and then absorbed into the accumulating pile of unanswered questions that this case has been generating ever since. When an institution has enough power, even the public accusation that it has corrupted a murder investigation is not enough to force the truth into the open. The third is about Margaret Gibson dying on her kitchen floor in 1964. She had carried what she knew for 42 years. She had watched the coverage. She had built a quiet, small life under a name that was not hers, in a city that had long since moved on from the scandal her crime had produced. And on the night she saw the television program mention Taylor's name, something broke in her. She became hysterical. She said she had killed him and thought it was long forgotten. The relief in that sentence, thought it was long forgotten, is the kind of relief that belongs to someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and finally, in the last hours available, put it down. She did not get to the priest in time. She died with the confession made but the accounting uncompleted. Whatever she had hoped for from that kitchen floor, absolution, closure, some version of being believed, the world did not have time to give it to her. William Desmond Taylor was 49 years old on the night of February 1, 1922. He had spent the better part of his adult life building a life that bore no resemblance to the one he had been born into. He had abandoned a name and a family and a past and reinvented himself in the most fertile landscape available for reinvention that the 20th century had yet produced. He had, by most accounts, managed to become genuinely good at what he did and genuinely decent toward the people around him. He walked Mabel Normand to her car, blew her a kiss, and went back inside to what he probably expected to be an ordinary February evening. The figure in the long coat with the collar turned up was already on its way. The sound that Faith McLean heard was not a car. And the person who walked down those steps and turned left into the alley has, for over 100 years, carried no official accountability for what they did, because the people who arrived at that bungalow before the police understood that accountability, in Hollywood in 1922, was something that could be managed. Something that could be removed, like a letter from a filing cabinet, before anyone official had a chance to read it. If you have watched this far, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you think William Desmond Taylor deserved better than what the city and the industry he worked for gave him, share this video. Because the oldest unsolved murder in Hollywood history is not a puzzle. It is a choice. Someone chose not to solve it. And that choice has held for 100 years.